Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a full and great panel here. I feel like it's a little difficult to follow the robots, but we'll do our best. Hi everyone, I'm McLean Clutter. I'm an associate professor at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And in this panel, which is the second to the last of our Living a Digital Life Michigan meeting, we'll discuss the myriad ways that digital technology, digital culture, and forms of knowledge and experience that have been profoundly impacted by the digital are complexly intertwined with the environment. And I imagine that in the course of our conversation this afternoon, we'll no doubt pick up on some of the themes and topics that we've been discussing throughout the past 2 days of this conference. So what do we mean by environment? Well, in the broadest sense, we mean quite literally the world around us, the complex interplay between the built and natural that constitutes the theater of everyday life. But the contemporary digital condition somewhat complicates the clarity of this definition of environment. With the rapid emergence of digital technology in the past decades, we've become accustomed to the idea that the digital sphere now constitutes a sort of environment of its own. As we've been discussing already in various ways for the past 2 days, today we live inside the digital. Increasingly, our public and private lives are conducted online and in digital space, where our relationships are forged, nurtured, or deleted, where our bills are paid and our finances tracked, and where our ideologies are fed by and our politics balkanized by our respective media bubbles. Meanwhile, and simultaneous to the emergence of the digital as a kind of environment of its own, technology has become diffuse, perhaps less physically obtrusive, but more pervasive in our surroundings. Digital technology is so distributed and ubiquitous that it has itself become environmental, spread across our smart cities and homes, carried with us in pockets and bags, distributed in swarms of sensors monitoring ecologies, climate, and economies. So our surroundings are increasingly affected by data collected by ubiquitous technology and populated by aesthetics and experiences native to the digital sphere. And increasingly, habits of life born of digital interaction have migrated into our living rooms and streets. So even while we all conduct more and more of our lives inside the digital, kind of metaphorically redacted from corporeal existence by screen or interface, even while that is happening, it's increasingly difficult to separate the digital, natural, and built environments. Life ensues within a complex interplay between the three. So this session's panelists will contribute to a discussion of the digital as environment, each in their own way. So I anticipate we'll hear for example, some challenges to the ostensible newness of phenomena like smart cities and artificial intelligence, as some of our panelists historicize and theorize their surrounding discourses, and perhaps problematize the politics and ideologies therein. I think we'll also hear about how digital technology might open up new modes of public engagement and participation in issues surrounding the built and natural environments, and how digital technologies might be deployed to make those environments more equitable or healthy. And I think this will set us up for an interesting discussion about how we might harness the promise of our contemporary digital environments, but with critical consciousness to guide our work. So with that, I'll introduce the panelists, and these will be short introductions because they all have kind of stellar and long CVs. So first, we'll hear from Shannon Manor. Shannon is a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research. Her writing and teaching focuses on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, media infrastructures, spatial epistemologies, and mediated sensation and exhibition. She's the author of the book, The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, also the book, Deep Mapping the Media City, and Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. All of these were published by the University of Minnesota Press. In addition to writing dozens of articles and book chapters, she also contributes as a regular long-form columnist about urban data and mediated infrastructures to Places, a journal focusing on architecture, urbanism, and landscape. And she collaborates on public design and interactive projects and exhibitions. Next, we will hear from Mark Lindquist, who is an assistant professor of landscape architecture in the School for Environment and Sustainability here at the University of Michigan. Mark's research and teaching focuses on the design and evaluation of high-performance landscapes with an emphasis on multifunctional green infrastructures in urban areas. He's particularly interested in understanding how engaging with computation and data can transform the design process, as well as inform decision-making by stakeholders. Mark conducts empirical research with the aim of providing an evidence base to support the design and planning of environments that perform ecologically, socially, and culturally for more sustainable outcomes. And then we'll hear from Nancy Love, who is the Borchardt and Gleason Collegiate Professor in the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering here at the University of Michigan. Her research group works at the interface of water, infrastructure, and public health in both domestic and global settings, focusing on assessing and advancing public and environmental health using chemical, biological, and analytical approaches applied to water systems using both physical experiments and computational models. Through her work, she evaluates the fate of chemicals, pathogens, and contaminants of emerging concern in water with relevance to public health and the environment, using technologies to sense and remove these constituents and advancing technologies that recover useful resources from water. And then finally, we'll hear from Molly Wright Steenson, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Research in the College of Fine Arts at Carnegie Mellon University, where she is also the K&L Gates Associate Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies and an Associate Professor in the School of Design. She's the author of Architectural Intelligence, How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape from MIT Press in 2017, which explores the radical history of design, architecture, AI, and cybernetics from the 1950s to the present. Molly has also worked with the web since 1994, a context I imagine some of you know her from first, at companies such as Reuters, Netscape, and Razorfish, and she co-founded Maxi, an award-winning women's webzine in the 1990s. As a design researcher, she examines the effect of personal technology and digital media on their users, including projects in India and China for Microsoft Research and Red Associates for Intel Research. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Okay, so thanks very much to the organizers. Thanks to all of you for being here. So I was asked to historicize the idea of digital or intelligent environments, and that was the primary purpose of my most recent book, where I covered just a humble scope, 5,000 years of how cities have been intelligent environments. So I'm going to cover a slightly smaller time frame here today. So if you believe the hype, we're on the cusp of an urban future in which embedded sensors, ubiquitous cameras and beacons, network smartphones, and the operating systems that link them all together will produce unprecedented efficiency, connectivity, and social harmony in the most kind of utopian frameworks. We're transforming the idealized topology of the open web and the Internet of Things into urban form. Programmer and tech writer Paul McFedries explains this thinking, and this is a long quote from him. The city is a computer, the streetscape is an interface, you are the cursor, and your smartphone is the input device. This is the user-based, bottom-up version of the city as computer idea. But there's also a top-down version, which is systems-based. It looks at urban systems such as transit, garbage, and water, and wonders whether the city could be more efficient and better organized if those systems were smart. The city as computer model has spun off more nuanced subcategories, including city as platform or city as operating system. Each of these metaphors suggests different sites and agencies for urban planning and administration and citizenship. They focus our attention on either figure or ground, structure or infrastructure, interface or code. These metaphors also hold connotations regarding the depth of planners, administrators, and citizens' potential intervention in city making, or the ways that information flows through an urban system, or what kinds of civic data or wisdom or operable or executable or even valued. I wrote about these epistemological metaphors in an essay a few years ago. Well, projects like which some of you might be familiar with, Sidewalk Toronto and Songdo in South Korea, were conceived in an age of big data and cloud computing. They're rooted in earlier reveries. Ever since the internet was little more than a few linked nodes, urbanists, technologists, and sci-fi writers have envisioned cybercities and utopias built from the net up. Modernist designers and futurists saw morphological parallels between urban forms and circuit boards. Just as the new modes of telecommunication have always reshaped physical terrains and political economies, new computational methods have informed urban modeling, planning, and administration. So I'm going to look at a few of those metaphors and how they shape the way we think about cities and environments. Environments itself is a metaphor for thinking about what a space is, and so are pockets and bubbles and other things that have come up over the past few days. So the first subset is machines, organisms, and ecosystems. Modernity is good at renewing metaphors, from the city as machine, to the city as organism or ecology, to the city as a cyborgian merger of the technological and the organic. These metaphors go a long way in determining how we conceive of urban planning, urban form, governance, maintenance, citizenship, and so forth. And as I'm speaking mostly at the urban scale, we could apply this to architecture and kind of more macro and micro scale ways of conceiving of space too. The city as machine is the sum of its divisible parts. It focuses on capitalist growth, strives for efficiency, and can be repaired piecemeal. I think I might be one slide behind here. Some argue that the machinic city has a history much deeper than the machine age itself, as evidenced by the use of grid layouts, linear patterns, and regular geometric forms since ancient times, and by the use of standardized patterns for colonial urban development. Then we have the city as organism, which reflects the influence of the natural sciences in the 18th and 19th centuries. This model frames the city as a self-contained, autonomous entity composed of differentiated parts or organs serving complementary functions. As Kevin Lynch, who Molly knows about very well, explains, the city as organism, like the city as machine, does have differentiated parts, but they work together and influence each other in subtle ways. Form and function are indissolubly linked, and the function of the whole is complex, not to be understood simply by knowing the nature of the parts." End quote. A more specific conception of the city as organism is that of the city as a biophysical body, with its own circulatory, respiratory, nervous systems, and waste systems. In the mid-19th century, as industrialization transformed cities and spurred their growth, physicians were developing new theories of infectious diseases, ideas like miasma and filth, complete with scientific models and maps that depicted cities as unhealthy. City planners and health officials joined forces to advocate for sanitation reform, which I'm sure we'll hear about in some of the later presentations today, zoning, new infrastructures, street improvements, and urban parks. Healthy buildings and cities were associated with certain phenotypical expressions, although designers didn't always agree on the ideal form. We have Frederick Law Olmsted's parks, Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful movement, Ebenezer Howard's garden cities, 1920s zoning ordinances, modernist social housing projects and sanatoria. All promised reform, yet produced distinct morphologies. Historian Jennifer Light describes how in the early 20th century, the new urban professions sought to deliver the prestige and predictability of the natural sciences and scientific management to the nature of development, or to the development of nature and to their professions. Some urbanists were originally drawn to the laboratory models of chemistry and physics, before acknowledging that their experimental methods didn't always lend themselves well to the ethical application in the urban realm. Ultimately, the field research methods and conceptual models of plant and animal ecologists proved more fitting, and framed cities as ecosystems in need of scientific management and conservation. Then we'll move on to a next category, operating systems, urban data, and civic knowledge. There's no shortage of recent think pieces calling for systems thinking in urban design. Yet much of this discourse can trace its genealogy back to cybernetics after World War II, again, which Molly knows about really well, which was itself informed by computational and militaristic models. Urban scientists modeled the city as an informational or logistical system, and city planning as a science of communication, information, and control. Cybernetic approaches to urbanism are the clear precursors to contemporary calls for cities built from the internet up, as is currently under development, questionably so, in Toronto. The city as computer model appeals because it frames the messiness of urban life as programmable and subject to rational order. Yet we also need to recognize another thread of this metaphor's genealogy. That is, the city as an apparatus for record-keeping and information management, as an embodiment of epistemology. We've long conceived of our cities as knowledge repositories and data processors, and they've always functioned as such. Lewis Mumford observed that when the wandering rulers of European Middle Ages settled in capital cities, they installed a, quote, regiment of clerks and permanent officials, and established all manner of paperwork and policies, deeds, tax records, passports, fines, and regulations, etc., which necessitated a new urban apparatus, specifically the office building, to house its bureaus and its bureaucracy. Yet the city's informational role began even earlier than that. Writing and urbanization developed concurrently in the ancient world, and those early scripts on clay tablets, mud brick walls, and landforms of various types were used to record transactions, mark territory, celebrate ritual, and embed contextual information in the landscape. Mumford describes the city as a fundamentally communicative space, rich in information. This is a couple-sentence-long quote from him, from Lewis Mumford. Through its concentration of physical and cultural power, the city heightened the tempo of human intercourse and translated its products into forms that could be stored and reproduced. Through its monuments, written records, and orderly habits of association, the city enlarged the scope of all human activities, extending them backward and forward in time, again through their recording. Mumford City is a large, complex, and varied epistemological and bureaucratic apparatus. It's an information processor, to be sure, but it's also more than that. Such metaphors give rise to technical models, which inform design processes, which in turn shape knowledges and politics, not to mention the material cities themselves. The sites and systems where we locate the city's informational functions, the places where we see information processing, storage, and transmission happening in the urban landscape, like those data centers we saw in the panel before lunch, for instance, all shape larger understandings of urban intelligence. This brings me to the last metaphor I'll look at. So what happens when we suture one metaphor onto another, when we combine the organism and the computer? Well, some geographers and planners have drawn on the figure of the cyborg, which I know some of you have little badges proclaiming yourselves to be cyborgs, to address this new form of hybrid urbanism. I was prompted for a recent exhibition and catalog for that exhibition to examine what it means to think about cities as graphs. So, imagine the machine learning algorithm processes a training set composed of images of grafted fruit trees. It watches as gardeners and farmers cut underperforming but still sturdy trees down to a stubby rootstock. They then trim healthy shoots from more desirable trees, insert those shoots, or what are called scions, around the bark of the rootstock, and then they bandage it all up. Over time, the rootstocks and the scions vascular tissues grow together. This is what we call inosculation. And after a couple of growing seasons, the machine observes the gardeners will yield sturdier, hardier, disease-resistant trees that produce more fruit at a much younger age than their unadulterated kin. The machine has learned to graft and has observed which methods generate the greatest yield. We then port that grafting algorithm over to the urban planning lab, where our data scientists aim to graft a healthier, sturdier, more fruitful city, an urban scion, onto some underperforming rootstock. Our planning algorithm searches aerial imagery and street view images to identify barren waterfronts, brownfields, and blighted neighborhoods with potential for resuscitation. It then grafts onto the urban rootstock a lattice of urban systems, pipes and cables and roads and buildings, in patterns it has learned from other successful cities. Over time, the roots and scions, infrastructural veins and arteries are sutured together. And after a few months, the urban machine is able to sustain a vibrant ecosystem of people and Dutch grocery bikes and King Charles Spaniels and vegan eateries. And its yield of data and profit is abundant. So these are the markers of a healthy city, as you can probably tell, so this is how cities are cultivated in an age in which the science of urban science draws more from data and computer science than from horticulture and ecology. Here, the old art of grafting is algorithmicized and engineered. Yet cities have always been grafted terrains. Those that have sustained more than a couple generations of inhabitants bear layers of their material history. In the urban strata, we find evidence of the Anthropocene, trash, construction materials, and ruins that chronicle a human's alteration of the planet. Urban facades sport shrouds of territorial markings, official proclamations, and commercial insignia. And enduring cities that, over the course of their long lives, have been usurped by empires or claimed by colonizers, often host grafted architectures and infrastructures manifesting their mixed lineages, their entangled roots, and scrambled genetic codes. The term graft derives from the Greek graphine, or stylus, probably because those scion shoots looked an awful lot like writing implements. The city is grafted in this graphic sense, too. It's a polyglot palimpsest of codes and scripts and plans. And if we trace its lineage all the way back to Uruk and Çatalhöyük, among the earliest large-scale human settlements, we can see that the city has long mediated between multiple modes of inscription, transmission, and storage. Legal codes and copper cables, algorithms and antennae, public proclamations and system protocols, clay tablets and ceramic type. Over generations and millennia, urban inhabitants have grafted code to clay, data to dirt, ether to ore. But today's data grafters tend to cut the rootstock off at the stump, excising inconvenient precedent, erasing legacy scripts. A too low tree graft makes the organism susceptible to soil pathogens. The scion depends on the rootstock's built-up immunities. Similarly, when our contemporary urban testbed prospectors, in their pursuit of tabula rasa development, uproot the foundations of the city, they forsake the immunities of experience, the accreted defenses of history, the embedded and embodied knowledges of local communities. Yet, a city is not a tree, as architect Christopher Alexander reminds us. He contrasts two urban structures, that of the semilattice and that of the tree. The organic semilattice is a city that is a complex fabric, a structure that has arisen more or less spontaneously over many, many years. It is thick and tough and subtle. The city tree, by contrast, is characterized by its structural simplicity and minimal overlap among its urban units, whether zones or arteries or superblocks. The tree is the signature of the artificial city, deliberately created by designers and planners to reflect their compulsive desire for neatness and order, end quote. Designers and planners have supposedly evolved beyond the hubris and folly of the master plan city. But instead, maybe they've merely sublimated the master plan in the machine, grafted algorithms into blueprints. They've swapped neural nets for compulsive desires, automation for deliberation, sublimely exhaustive data sets for neatness and order. In the end, though, they're still grafting city trees. When we think in terms of cities, Alexander warns, we're trading the humanity and richness of the living city for a conceptual simplicity which benefits only designers, planners, administrators, and developers. Every time a piece of city is torn out and a tree made to replace the semilattice that was there before it, the city takes a further step towards dissociation, end quote. Grafting is an integral component of urban evolution. But in this newest variation on a well-rehearsed practice, we have to be wary of our new scions, those offshoots of the tech giants. This is another meaning of the term scion. And we must protect the rootstock, which is what keeps us grounded and resilient, and at the same time, mindful of the many foregoing graftings that have produced the thick, tough, and subtle semi-lattice structure of our organic cities. Machines, organisms, bodies, ecologies, computers, operating systems, networks, platforms, cyborgs, graphs, and in a longer version of this I also talk about parasites, which is a favorite part, but I had to cut it out for time today. So each model is necessarily reductive, but when recognized as partial and temporary rather than totalizing lenses, when deployed in tandem, when triangulated, they reveal the city, even this smart city to come, if it's not already here, in its prismatic complexity, and they suggest multiple courses of action. Thank you.
Is that right? Just checking. Okay.
All right, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Really interesting talk so far. I think this might be a little different. Maybe that's what we're here for, I'm not sure. So there's often a lot of celebration around new digital and social media. However, often they don't live up to the hype, or worse, have even more negative impacts than not living up to the hype. And of course, these critiques of technology aren't new. They go back as long as technology has been advancing. I'm interested in kind of not looking at these big technological advances, but more interested in empirically evaluating how technology can positively transform the design process to better engage and inform stakeholders. So looking at more of an individual and local scale. This all started 20 years ago when I was involved in a project on the Toronto waterfront where we worked with community members to challenge what we thought was a poor precedent for urban design. So you can see the kind of wireframe. This was really advanced graphics 20 years ago, trust me. The wireframe was the kind of developer proposal that had been approved by City Council. Oh, I think there's a timer on. So we used visualizations at that point to kind of empirically convince people that what was happening actually wasn't a great idea. And so you can see on the very far, your right, that red outline, that tower the developer had approved at Toronto City Council is actually in the Toronto City Airport flight path. And so we were able to use these visualizations to actually show people that this probably wasn't a good idea and you might not want that tower there. But we also had an agenda to try to go away from what the Toronto waterfront now is to something a little bit more livable. The project involved a lot of kind of technical workshops with the public in the immersive visualization lab at the University of Toronto. Proved very effective for some things. And since then I've been interested in immersive environments generally and how they can contribute to spatial decision making. So this is from quite a few years ago, but this was at a time when everyone was building these $1 million caves for visualizations, and this was about a $4,000 immersive kind of wraparound environment that we used that was, I thought, just as good as those $1 million caves. But then there were also other forms of decision making. So for example, this project timeline that a student of mine worked on in our immersive environment, he said afterwards he wouldn't have been able to even conceptualize this relative to a kind of normal Gantt chart without being able to just kind of have the information wrap around him. My lab's been using virtual reality for public engagement around primarily open space design, green infrastructure in Detroit. And based on the observations of using it with people in these kind of public environments, not really research environments, our analysis, we're now conducting experiments in the lab on the perceptual impact of VR and other technologies on decision making. And I think one interesting thing that we're starting to explore is the fact that if you look at this guy, there's a kind of generational thing that we've observed, and we've had hundreds of people go through looking at these environments in VR. Older people, gross generalization, tend to put it on and freeze, like that guy is, because they're freaked out. You put it on younger kids and they just start trying to touch grass, everything else. So I think there's something there that's really interesting. My lab also investigates multisensory perception and the impact on how people understand the environment in different modes. And visualizations, research has shown they still lag far behind the experience of the real world. And we think that multimodal interaction offers one technique to overcome some of those deficiencies. So we use a lot of lab-based experiments in conjunction with more of the community-embedded work to empirically evaluate responses to virtual environments. This one in particular, looking at sound. And we've shown significant impacts on visual perception that adding sound has. All of this has kind of led to the realization that a lot of these tools, the digital technologies we're employing, are really still out of the reach of normal people. So this led to this project, which is co-designing a video game-based software for residents, so actually working with them to design the software so they can use it to design their own landscapes. So actually maybe putting us all out of work once this software gets to its full development. And I probably don't have to tell everybody this, but green infrastructure can have a positive ecological and social contribution in urban environments. But there's often a missed opportunity to involve residents in the planning and design of green infrastructure. And involving them can lead to more successful and resilient outcomes. Co-design, at least in landscape architecture, urban planning, goes by quite a few different names. A lot of people have written about it over the years. More recently, it's been mandated by a lot of kind of international conventions so that these processes need to be embedded in design and planning. And research is showing that integrating the concepts of ecosystem services into this decision-making can help normal people kind of more specifically aid in the conceptualization of the benefits that green infrastructure and open space can have. And there are people who have worked on this. They've developed tools for kind of green infrastructure design and planning. But you can see, you know, with this, you can make a change and you get a kind of readout of this graph in terms of the benefits. But a lot of my research has shown that the average person doesn't really understand what this map means anyway. So we think that 3D visualizations, combining that with some of this technology and some of the quantitative feedback, is one way to overcome some of those deficits. But there are challenges. Pardon me. Integrating ecosystem service into public participation processes is complicated. The values of these different ecosystem services vary based on cities, within cities, between different people. It's influenced by environmental and socioeconomic characteristics of the community in question. So we think that collaboration and engagement with community members to specify specifically what's important to them is critical to any process like this. And these require decision support systems that are flexible and can integrate varied views and metrics into the decision-making process. So our project aimed to identify a broad and inclusive range of community goals relating to green infrastructure and open space design, co-create a user-friendly, realistic, easy-to-use 3D computer interface for design, evaluate that with the people we design it with, and hopefully empower the community involved to design their own green infrastructure. Overarching research questions that we're hoping to answer: will developing digital tools that couple data with 3D visualizations facilitate the design of higher performing landscapes? And will co-creating these tools with the end users increase adoption and satisfaction? So we use a lot of different methods, but community-based participatory research, structured decision-making to elicit the objectives, Scrum software development to actually develop the software, user experience with collaborators in the School of Information, and then qualitative evaluation of the entire process at the end. So for this specific project, we had 2 different stakeholder groups. We had 5 workshops with each of them. We kind of, you know, not really fancy method, a lot of pen and pencil and papers, but kind of recording what they have, and then trying to operationalize how you might incorporate those metrics and ideas into the software that we're developing. We don't show this complicated diagram to the people, it's internal. And then we actually get down to like specific items that they may want. And it does risk kind of becoming, you know, a bit of a kit of parts idea, but people specifically that we're working with in the east side of Detroit want all of these very specific things in their landscapes. And that's just a diagram of the software development process. So then we take that, develop the software, use it with the people to design actual landscapes in their neighborhood. Some examples of the prototypes. We started very simply. So we had this tree planting shovel. Some have seen this presentation before, but our video game developer was coming right from the video game world. So initially he had a tree planting gun. So you shoot trees into the landscape. So we thought that might not be the most appropriate. But you could also kind of see the very beginning of you're altering the landscape, editing the terrain, and we can visualize the kind of catchment areas in a relatively crude way of where the water's going to go. and also water flow catchment and volume analysis, so we can set with these kind of diamond things spill points to get a rough idea of how much water the landscape is going to be able to absorb. The second prototype, we got a bit more realistic. It took to the second prototype to realize people wanted to be able to fly up and actually look around at it. And then starting to get some of the more specific metrics, so you can see on the left-hand side there, every time you're adding a tree, you're dealing with stormwater in different ways. So trying to really let people understand how vegetation, how the terrain is going to impact the flooding. In the current beta, we're getting more detailed kind of cost analysis. That's probably one of the most important things with the residents we're working with. That just shows another view, nothing else. And then again, getting kind of more vegetation, more different species, different metrics based on what the different groups actually thought was important. And given the audience, I thought I wanted to show that there's still room for speculative design here. It's not all just pragmatic, straightforward. And in terms of preliminary results, it is definitely increasing satisfaction with the kind of final product and the process. Supported the decision making. Compared to designing without using the software, the landscapes have a much higher functionality. And the next steps, further testing and evaluation with different stakeholder groups, expanding the metrics based on different stakeholders, and we're also testing it with designers, so not just residents, trying to see how it might aid people in various aspects of their own engagement. And we're also, because we're using Unity to actually make the software, we're looking at adding a more interactive kind of gaming element to it, and also engaging youth in the design. And we want to, the projects that we worked with, the two groups, they've actually built a couple of projects they designed, and we wouldn't mind going back and asking them, is this actually kind of, compared to what we did in the software, is this outcome what you thought it was going to be? We have a big team, game developers, landscape architects, School of Information, collaborators here, SEAS, computer science and gaming at Dearborn, partners, Alliance for the Great Lakes and the Eastside Community Network in Detroit convened all the workshops for us, and the USDA gave us some funding. We'll see. No. That's supposed to play a great demo of it for you, but wait. Oh, it popped up under here. A bit pixelated. We have some overly precise costs in there. Every time you dig a hole, it's not like $129.73. And our rain simulation has evolved a little bit. It's complicated to visualize water flowing. Who knew? Oh, and also one of the major things that came out of talking with people, what do I got, like a minute maybe? The ability to actually age the trees and change the seasons. I think what happens a lot, especially with landscape architects, we show these design plans with like 50-year oaks and everybody says that park looks amazing, and then you plant a tree that's like this big and everybody says, what happened to my park? So actually being able to show them the cost initially of planting that sapling, but what it could do in terms of that long-term impact, both visually and also how that tree exponentially increases in terms of air quality, water, evapotranspiration, things like that. Thank you.
Not sure where we are.
Oops. What did he do to you?
I don't know. Or maybe we just closed that out. Thank you, thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do something a little different here. I don't study the digital form and so forth. I'm one of those who, I guess, is a user. But I'm going to tell you a story. And I know you know what I look like because I'm standing here, so you don't need to see my face on a slide. But I'm going to tell you my story of entering into kind of the digital social media world. And it's going to be a story that talks about science and doing science in an environmental justice rich environment and the kind of way in which that has translated for me in some of the pitfalls. And then literally I just got a message from someone in that world related to even this presentation. So it's a very rich experience that I've had, and I wanted to share it with you. I'll say up front that I'm actually in the process of doing some work on a proposal that I think would benefit from the kind of work that's happening at this conference as it relates to public sector services, infrastructure, water, power, food, and equitable access for all people in cities, bringing in distributed systems which necessarily require kind of smart technologies, but doing it in a way that actually provides that access that we so strive for. I won't get into that, but I'm happy to speak with folks about that later. So this is my life on Twitter. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about this. I entered into Twitter in May of 2013, and I was really geeked when I realized that the Twitter handle love_H2O had not been taken. My last name is Love, and I work in water. So I thought, no way, I have to get on Twitter. So that's really how I started. Really, with the goal and objective being to be a positive kind of voice in the environmental kind of arena, sharing information, not only the research that maybe is going on at the University of Michigan with students and collaborators, and I'm not a huge self-promoter of myself, although I'll show you some images that will give you the opposite impression. I do tend to really try to focus on that of others. And I'm going to talk to you about that, and then I'm going to take you into my world as some of the research that I was doing, and I'm continuing to do. I was literally just in Flint this morning coming back, but it entered into the Flint water crisis, and how social media and the digital world has really conveys and manages and controls and complicates the conversation there for scientists working in that environment as well as the people in the community. And so just kind of generally, I use social media to engage with others around topics relevant to my discipline in water quality engineering. I do environmental engineering, but I do a lot of science. And work coming out of my group. So when students defend their thesis, we'll pop up a picture like the one on the left side. I don't have a huge following. 1,600 people is a lot, but you know, my likes, if I get 35 likes, that's a lot. I'm not one of those who's blasting out there with thousands. I do work in resource recovery, so I'm showing you a picture of a toilet. This is an awesome toilet. It is a game-changing toilet, I can tell you. And if you want to know more, I'm excited to tell you about it. We're trying to get it to the United States here in the next year, but I do work on converting kind of the resources of nitrogen and phosphorus in our waste into useful products, as opposed to the very wasteful way in which we manage it today. And then I run a National Science Foundation program that they go around and they get different PIs on video and make these wonderful videos of us. And so while there were, you know, I had this National Science Foundation video that was put out, and there are a lot of people who look at it, you know, almost 5,000 at the time I took this snap. So, but behind each of these pictures is a story. The one on the left side, the student who completed that work, and you can see the one committee member who didn't make it physically, so he's on Skype in the picture in the back. Her work was related to the point of use filters similar to those deployed in Flint in response to the lead crisis. And so the work that she was doing was very politically fraught, but very, very important. And I was learning as I went. I don't do community-based participatory research, and now I guess I do because I've been working with members of the community who've been teaching me how to do this and learning as you go. And you know, our work shows that there are complexities within the water system there beyond lead. And We have, along every step of the way, made sure that our results were shared with residents when the data were complete and could be shared with those who graciously gave us access to their homes and had a right to the data that they often didn't have when others had control of it, but also with the medical field so that they understood what we were seeing even before we could publish our work, and our work is still in the process of being published. So tweeting out this image, I knew the impact it was going to have, because the other side of my story is those who choose to try to craft a different narrative than what the science shows. And we felt it was always very important to put out facts and what was happening in that. And so I'm going to share with you kind of the other side of my life on Twitter. And what was happening in the process of doing this work, you may read in the newspapers that there's kind of these science wars going on, and yes, I am a member of a group that is part of that. And actually, frankly, we've been on the receiving end of many aggressive acts, not on the output end. There are people who are not in the university community, people who are in communities affected by lead, not just Flint, but other cities, who have partnered with people in Flint to try to help them have a voice and have their own voice around what's wrong with their water. And then there are some scientists who didn't want that voice to be heard, frankly. And in one case in particular, there were some individuals, including residents of Flint, who were sued by a scientist. And one of those individuals who was sued is a medical anthropologist who doesn't live in Flint, but who was being intimidated in an attempt to silence her because the kind of commentaries she was making on social media and digitally and to media and to journalists didn't comply with the message that that scientist wanted to have out there. And so I chose to reverse that silencing and invite her to come talk to my Engineering 100 class about environmental justice and listening in communities, something that we're supposed to talk about ethics in Engineering 100, and everybody gets their slides out, and 40-deck slide, and talks to students and tells them what ethics are. And what I chose to do was invite Dr. Lambrinidou to come to my class and not talk about Flint, because it was politically fraught, but to talk about other cases. But upon having her come to my class, tweet out that middle picture of her talking to freshman engineers about listening and kind of the epistemology and some of the elements that you're talking about, but doing it in a way that engineers can hear and really kind of trying to start them on the right foot, especially as a lot of students want to work in communities, but we don't know how. Engineers are not trained how to do this. And it was so well received by the students. I mean, we had a homework assignment around it, and she really did a wonderful job. That tweet has resulted in me getting FOIA'd, in me having somebody submit a suggestion that I have an ethics complaint against me with the professional society over a false claim. Again, this kind of science wars of the scientist who doesn't like her having a voice. And so what I'm showing you here is that I continued to use digital media to not allow this other person to silence me either, and to continue to acclaim her work. She wrote a paper that went into the Michigan Journal of Sustainability that I encourage you all to read, that I consider a brilliant piece. It's tweeted up here, that really focuses on engineers with intent to do good and what can go wrong. And just trying to reverse that impact. So I share this with you because I think that for me as a person in science who's very committed to water quality and making sure that everybody has access to it, not only that people deserve to have safe water, but people deserve to have confidence in their water. They're different. And how I've found myself entering into using a digital platform to be a credible scientist trying to also make sure that those who don't feel they have a voice have a voice. And it's a bit of a perilous place. I'm sure some of you have thoughts about this. The things that go on, especially in kind of cities that I think are not out there, and right now what I'm in the process of doing and learning about is I'm recreating my own existence on the web as an outcome of this. So I guess what I want to kind of close with is just some comments. What is the role for and how to use social media when working as a scientist in an affected or marginalized community? So my experience with digital media in Flint relates in the following way. So one of the things is that Facebook is a really powerful and important platform within the communities that I've worked in Flint. I see it in Detroit, I see it in Benton Harbor, and I think there are others, about what's happening in the community and who the trusted community voices are. I see some of my colleagues trying to enter into community, but really don't have that knowledge of the trusted community. And so I think Facebook, I've realized, is that platform. Now that I'm very engaged with many people who are claimed as activists or community leaders in Flint, I'm hearing all the time, even this morning up in Flint, how something we're doing together, she's like, oh, I can't wait to put that out on my Facebook page. So this is the way in which a lot of communication occurs. Activists and their advocates watch what you post, who likes what you post, who I like, what I retweet. Every single action now that I do on Twitter is watched, and I know that. And so I'm very mindful of what I do, and I think I'm trying to stay true to my goal of putting out important information around water and water quality and not shying away from the environmental justice space. I've experienced scientists who have a different agenda in the community than I do, who use social media, Twitter, Facebook, blogs, in ways that cause chaos. They do harm to others, including the community they originally intended to help. I think that's the primary focus, less so on me and my FOIAs, and worse. And when is misinformation on social media no longer an example of academic freedom and is instead an example of abuse, intimidation, and harassment? I do believe that what's happened in the sphere that I'm in and the individuals that I work around and with have had this translate into that latter sphere. But I've also come to learn in talking to even federal prosecutors who happen to live down the street from me that it's really hard to prove that the First Amendment is very powerful and that it's hard to kind of prove that. So I will just close by saying that where I am right now is developing a new website, and on that website, I am going to put my own voice out there. So Twitter's 240 characters, and I actually have an opportunity to speak and say what I believe instead of having somebody else say what I believe. And so my website will not only have the research on it, but will also have my statements and my presentations and my slides, and just learning to be more public, which I've usually not been. I tried to kind of stay in the scientific kind of box. We have Twitter plans now, scripted. Next week I'm going to a conference. We've got something down to the T when a presentation occurs and when we're going to tweet out a website showing a community-based activity that we developed to help the community manage their point of use filters, how to do it, how to maintain it. I'm going through media training. In fact, after this, I have to go off and learn how to be interrogated by a reporter and how to handle it. And then I'll just say that this week or next week, I thought it was this week, but my book hasn't come. There's a book coming out called Flint Fights Back by Ben Pauley. And if any of you are interested in kind of some of this whole issue of kind of the media, the digital life, and a community in crisis, there's quite a bit in that book that Ben conveys that I think will be of interest to those of you who research this. And so that's my story, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Us.
All right, hello. Wonderful to be here among so many friends, friends who are at the scale of family and at a Venn diagram of so much of my life. Thank you very much, all of you, for having me. I was trying to figure out what to call this talk today. I went back and forth between landscapes, provocations, chapters, and I just settled on landscapes. And so I'm going to present 3 different landscapes, kind of 3 chapters of landscapes. One is called What is AI? One is called The Prisoner, and the third is called Lawrenceville. They're all different elements of digital landscapes in different kinds of ways, in ways that I've been trying to think through them. What is AI? If you plug AI into Google image search, you get something that looks like this. If you look more closely, you see this, the vector head, beams coming out of the eyes, kind of genderless weirdness going on to the earth. You see this nice kind of cyborgy chip behind. You see images like this where the hand beholds. One of my students did a color grab and took a look at the palette, and he pointed out that these colors and shapes are quite familiar when I think of AI, and as he sees it, it's cold and lonely and solo. One of the things that's interesting when you look at AI on Google image search is something here up at the top. You might notice this little bar. And if you look a little more closely, you'll see one of them says something like, this says human, and this says female. So if we click into female, this is what we get. It doesn't look very friendly. And some of the other words that it suggests to look for include things like sci-fi, bot, dark, and evil. So this is Cyborg Lady, as I call her. I believe this is jQuery that's going behind her, so our tech heads in the room might smile at that. If this is the future, this is our female, and Google says that this might be an artificial intelligence operator. And she shows up in interesting places on the web. For instance, Brits fear the AI future. She shows up there. IBM Watson, the ingredient brand helping inform the purposeful business of tomorrow. She shows up there. And my favorite, she works at IKEA. And if you actually do a Google search for artificial intelligence, what shows up on the page itself is this. Artificial intelligence field of study. This is going to link you back to Wikipedia with this weird set of eyes and kind of the usual trope of numbers and ciphers running down a face. And I'm borrowing a couple of things here. There's something that a writer named Eric Johnson wrote about these AI cliches as we know them. And he said these cultural cliches and touchstones are popular for another reason. It's really, really hard to talk about digital reality tech otherwise. These fields are full of jargon, inconsistent in practice, and difficult to grok if you haven't seen all the latest demos. Pop culture is a shortcut to a common ideal, a shared vision. And I could go on here and show numerous tropes of AI in movies, but I just wanted to stick for this one to Google image search. I borrowed this quote from my friend and colleague Dan Lockton, who he borrows from Kenneth Burke about why we use these kinds of metaphors. Metaphor is a device for seeing something in terms of something else. It brings out the thisness of that or the thatness of a this. I'm not totally sure what the thisness of that is about these cyborgs, but perhaps you have an idea. Okay, second chapter. I'm going to duck down the lights for this one, and it's going to get, I think I basically can do on and off. So for the next 5 minutes, it's going to be pretty dark. The prisoner. And by the prisoner, I mean this prisoner. Not voluntary prisoners of architecture, but I mean Patrick McGoohan and the prisoner. Who here has seen the show? Who here is a fan of the show? I was delighted, I see hands waving. I was delighted to find out that my friend and cohort mate, McLean, loves the show as much as I do. And one of the things I'm most fascinated with is the opening sequence, which every time is a little bit different because of the new number 2.
Where am I? In the village. What do you want? Information. Whose side are you on? That would be telling. We want information. 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 You won't get it. By hook or by crook, we will. Who are you? The new number 2. Who is number 1? You are number 6. I am not a number. I am a free man.
Okay, thank you for watching one of my favorite things in the entire world. I've probably watched this hundreds of times over the last 15 years because it's helping me to think through these connections and fears of surveillance, information, and architecture. So when we see this opening scene where he's pulling up in his prototype Triumph, and here he is going inside, and here's the man in the top hat. Here's the gas coming through the keyhole, and he's about to pass out. And as he's passing out, what you see in the background is the Whitehall Towers on Martian Street, which were designed by Eric Bedford, the UK chief architect. They were built between 1963 and 1971 during the time that The Prisoner was filmed. This episode was filmed in 1966. And these were referred to as the Three Ugly Sisters. They housed the Department of Environment and Transport, 3,600 workers, 450,000 square feet of office space, and they were universally reviled. It's hard to find much writing about them that's of any architectural note, and they were demolished in 2003. This is Port Marion, Wales. This is an Italianate nostalgic village, and it wasn't designed to be a surveillant village, but rather it was a planned holiday community designed by Sir Clough William Ellis. He was a contemporary of town planners such as Patrick Geddes and Raymond Unwin. I feel like there's a link back here to Shannon's talk at the beginning. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to put town planning notions into effect that would educate the general public about architecture and planning and to break boredom and tedium. And of his project, he said, let's see if I can actually get my cursor back. He said, "I was aimed at winning as yet uninterested and uninformed popular support for architecture, planning, landscaping, the use of color, and indeed for design generally, by a gay light opera sort of approach, whereby the casual visitor who had perhaps only turned up to bathe or to eat, or out of vague curiosity might be ensnared into taking a really intelligent interest in the things that give some of us fortunate ones such intense and abiding pleasure. And the stratagem works." Or we might say, it works for some people, maybe not for number 6. This is, of course, Rover, and Rover is the mechanism that keeps people stuck in the village. It's filmed from partly from a lava lamp, and it's basically a weather balloon that bounces on the water and suffocates people as they try to escape. But you see this round image pick up again in this ball chair and the round room. And you can see right here the different things going on. There's Rover, there's someone that Rover's catching. And this is the Aero Arnaio ball chair that you see the new number 2 sitting in. This is my favorite number 2, but it's always a different number 2. And there he is again. And I keep thinking of course, Kafka's The Trial. And probably my very favorite thing is these file cabinets and this kind of mirror of file cabinets that mean being resigned and being X'd out. I find myself thinking of Cornelia Wissmann, the late German media theorist and legal theorist, who wrote a book called Files. Files act on space and speech, and they exert an organizing presence. She writes, quote, "They lay the groundwork for the validity of the law, they work toward the law, they establish an order that they themselves do not keep." So some things that files do is enable transactions, and when they're spatialized, they act as barriers and relays. And as she writes, barriers that are porous as well as inaccessible, they emerge and disappear. In The Prisoner, the files are performing a lot of different transactions here. The type bars of typewriter marking McGowan's photograph with a row of X's, the armature delivering his punch card along a rail, the resigned drawer opening and closing. As administrative documents, files are not visible. They're not visible to those who are affected by their actions, an element that adds to the paranoia that they cause. And as Wissmann writes, in the 20th century, the guiding difference between public and private insights and interest in files. Secret files were and are perceived to be the opposite of democracy, which rings a little too true today. And here's just one bonus image for you for an information interface that appears in some of the episodes. This is the free information device, push and find out for the village. Final chapter is called Lawrenceville. Lawrenceville is where I live, and Google Street View will show you this picture of my house. That's the one with the bluish trim on a nice day. I live in a house of the future, in a city of the future. My house was built in 1890, and my city was built in 1787. Less than a half mile from my house, you'll find the National Robotics Engineering Center, as well as Carnegie Robotics. And at night, when we take my dog for a walk, we sometimes wander around to see what the office parks are doing, and what these landscapes look like. You can see things like this again through Google image search. This is something that became known as TechForge. And it's not far from my house again. This is up the block, and this is where Caterpillar's autonomous division is located, something that has had a long, long relationship with Carnegie Mellon. You might see piles of dirt that grow up into something like this. This is Argo. Many of the autonomous vehicle companies are headquartered in Pittsburgh. So here's Argo, and here's Argo's version for a safer tomorrow, driving across one of Pittsburgh's myriad bridges. Here's Uber ATG, and here's an image from inside of Uber ATG. But on these night walks with our dog, we can peer in and we can see these autonomous backhoes. And we snuck up a little closer, and we saw this nice image here with a picture in the background and the backhoes and bulldozers in the foreground. And I found myself thinking of one of my favorite Max Ernst paintings, Lop Lop stellt Lop Lop vor. Lop Lop introduces Lop Lop. It's as though here's the backhoe, and it's showing a nice image of himself or herself. The Caterpillar website tells us perception is everything, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Perception is indeed everything, and we tend not to think quite so negatively about autonomous vehicles when we're thinking of backhoes. But a lot of us turn instead to the trolley problem, and does anyone here know what the trolley problem is? Okay, not everybody. You'll know it in a minute. It was designed, it's a thought problem designed by Philippa Foot in 1967 in an essay about abortion rights. And your problem is this: there's a trolley coming down the track, there are 5 people tied to the track, and you have to throw a switch and decide, do you let the trolley continue and kill 5 people, or do you throw a switch and by your choice kill 1? What do you do? Who opts for the 5? Okay, and who opts for the 1? And who wishes I wasn't asking, right? Yeah, that's how a lot of us feel. So there are trolley problem memes. These are some of them. There is an entire Facebook group of trolley problem memes. Remember trolley problem guy here? He's on a mug. I got that mug. I'm very pleased. So trolley problem guy on the mug. This is my favorite trolley problem meme as someone who's been working on ethics lately. And then there's what a 2-year-old thinks of the trolley problem.
Uh-oh, Nicholas, this train is going to crash into these 5 people. Should we move the train to go this way, or should we let it go that way? Which way should the train go?
So as my friend and colleague Alex London puts it, if you're talking about moral problems, you've really got a bigger problem already. If we're jumping to trolley problems, we're already in a difficult spot. So as I close, I find myself returning to J.B. Jackson, and Claire Zimmerman gave me this piece to read in 2005 for our methods seminar, Discovering the Vernacular Landscape. And it's been helping me to think through these questions of landscape. And he writes that landscape is not scenery, it is not a political unit, it is really no more than a collection, a system of man-made spaces on the surface of the earth. Whatever its shape or size, it is never simply a natural space, a feature of the natural environment. It is always artificial, always synthetic, always subject to sudden or unpredictable change. We create them and need them because every landscape is the place where we establish our own human organization of space and time. So what do we make of these landscapes, these synthetic blue cyborg landscapes or Italianate landscapes that capture us and keep us? And what of the file cabinets and what of the files? And if landscapes are where we organize a human space and time, if it's where we establish our human organization of space and time, are they also where we sort out our expectations and our ethics? They're what confuses us when we cannot see. And so we walk back home, and I discover that Google Street View has captured my mother-in-law and my dog looks back at the Google Street View, and Carnegie Robotics reminds me that we're still hiring humans. Thank you.
Okay, we're a little over, but we're just going to have to keep these people from their coffee for a little longer, and see if we have time for a little bit of conversation. So I'm resisting a strong temptation to just talk about the prisoner, but I think that we have other things to talk about here. So in some ways, I think the panel breaks down into some kind of familiar lines, at least familiar lines to those of us that are designers. We have 2 kind of scholars and theorists who I think are reminding us of the kind of ethical or epistemological paradigms and kind of stakes of digital technology within the urban environment today. And then we have two actors, designers, or kind of activists in some cases that are using digital technologies to try to engage environments, urban environments, in ways that are meant to make them more aesthetic or healthful or just or even democratic. And so I wonder if we can kind of begin the conversation by putting those two groups a little bit into dialogue with one another. And so I guess maybe I'll start with a question for this side of the table, well, for Nancy and Mark. You guys hear me now? This is not even on. Now? Yeah. So Shannon began the conversation today talking about kind of technological metaphors, and Molly also talked about metaphor a bit, but technological metaphors and the kind of epistemologies that come with technological metaphors. And so I wonder if I could ask you two a question, a bit of a question about epistemology and how you think about it. So I'm wondering, and maybe to make that a little bit more of a broad question, I'm wondering how you think about both the kind of affordances and limitations of the technologies that you guys are using for community engagement, for impact in the urban environment. Like when using VR, Mark, you call your research empirical, and it is empirical. I'm wondering like how you understand what these kinds of technologies afford, but then also what they disclose. Like what do they take away? What does it limit in terms of both your agency as a landscape architect or the input of communities? And Nancy, I'm really interested in hearing you answer the question as well, because I thought my question for you when hearing about what you were going to present, I thought my question was going to be like, oh my gosh, don't the kind of social pathologies that we ever see, that we always see in social media, don't those things ever enter your work? And then I was shocked actually to see the presentation where, yes, they're all over the work. It's not a kind of, it's not a kind of benign engagement with social media in order to have kind of an impact in the kind of water ecology in Flint. In fact, you're in the woods with that every day. So again, the question is like, what do you think these kinds of technologies are limiting in terms of engagement, and what are their affordances?
I did mention the sort of kit of parts kind of end product that you end up with, because we are literally putting parts in and people can place them around. I think in terms of landscape architecture, I've always viewed this, I've presented some of this work at places where some people have gotten a little bit angry, kind of joked in the presentation, but they've said, well, is your ultimate goal to put landscape architects out of work because we won't need to design anything if everybody has something like this? That's not the goal, obviously. But it's also looking at it more from the point of view that the people that I'm at least working with right now, they're not going to hire a landscape architect, and they want to do something with their communities. And so I don't think it's a perfect solution, but I think it's a means to an end to enable people to start making better informed decisions about the landscapes that they're using and living in. And I think the VR question is interesting because I had my second slide, I think, saying that it's, VR is dead. I don't know what it was ever really supposed to deliver for us. It looked really compelling. The experiments that we're doing, we're finding that there might be a huge difference in terms of some things, but in terms of perception and some cognitive aspects, it's not really any different than just looking at a screen in the specific experiments that we're looking at. So I think, to me, a lot of it is we kind of work a lot on hunches, and I think we can just have more evidence to kind of inform what we're doing.
So I guess this is on. Yes, okay, here we go. So I think about this two different ways, I guess. I have, obviously I have kind of my engineering hat, and then I have my experience hat of working in communities, and they're different parts. So, so in terms of kind of the community piece, I've before kind of engaging in US-based resource constrained settings, I've done work in Africa and work there with universities and academic capacity building. And so I've always had a principle, even before then, of use a lot of FaceTime and not disappearing when the money goes away. And so that doesn't get replaced by digital, but it gets enhanced and enabled by the digital kind of platforms. And I have at least 6 different apps here, different ways people like to communicate with me, and I just adapt to all of them. And so I think that what it affords is it helps to build those relationships. I didn't start out kind of trying to get to the space I'm at, but that is where I'm at. And like this morning, we're giving a talk next week at a conference. It's important to physically be there, but those relationships have been enhanced by these technologies. What it takes away, though, is I think it's subject to misinterpretation, and I think some of the things that I mentioned, maybe in terms of abuses that can come as a result of some of the social media kind of platforms. I want to talk about my engineering hat, though, because I think very much this whole experience has helped me to think as an engineer about the kind of work I do, which is distributed, a lot of distributed water and now power and food kind of technologies, and thinking about how we advance those to make access to these public sector services more accessible. And I do know and believe that there is a digital, cyber element to it that enables those. Centralized systems are wonderful, but they're very inflexible. And the way you develop resilience is by having a hybrid that has a combination of decentralized and centralized. And the decentralized and the centralized have to talk to each other, and people are in the middle. And so that's the thinking I'm doing right now, and it's very informed by my experience in Flint and Ethiopia, in terms of the people part of it and maybe the co-production part of it. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great. And I wonder if we can kind of roll this out also into a question for you, Shannon. And maybe not even speaking directly to Nancy and Mark's work, but maybe about the technologies that they're using to try to impact the urban environment. So again, what I understand from your great presentation is that you begin with a kind of, in a way, a kind of cautionary tale about the kind of technological, epistemological metaphors that come with different kind of urban technologies, and the way that might limit our understanding or limit the possible range of action. But then you end in a really, I think, a really interesting place and more of a hopeful place, where I read this idea of kind of grouping different metaphors together in a way that I want to understand as a kind of repositioning of Christopher Alexander's semi-lattice, that you're not accepting just one kind of epistemological metaphor, but you're putting multiple together in ways of opening up ways of operating on the city in all of its complexity. So I'm wondering what kind of opportunities for that kind of action you might see in the kinds of technologies that Mark and Nancy are using. What liabilities do you see there? What potential limiting metaphors do you see in these kinds of technologies? And do you see ways of using it that might open up avenues to operating on the urban environment in all of its complexity?
So this might be... Is mine on? Yes. So this might be I am too close, maybe. Okay. I'm good. All right.
Right there.
Did somebody say they can't hear me? You can. Okay. All right. So I think even these different modes of structuring, I feel like the different modes of communication between these two presentations are just kind of different ways of structuring discourse. It's a way of kind of packaging it into 280 character bytes with maybe a picture attached, or formatting into a kit of parts. You also had some images you showed with just big sheets of white paper with, a textual list on it. So each one of these, I think, kind of evokes different metaphors of how we're structuring not only the conversation that produces kind of public design processes, but then the outcome of what that will be. Because if we kind of I'm going to use the Sidewalk Toronto one as the metaphor because it seems to be one of the canonical examples right now. If you decide from the get-go that you're going to be designing a city from the internet up, internet metaphors and kind of logics of organization and topologies are going to be structuring the conversation, and you already know what kind of your end result is going to be. That, in a sense, is kind of a fait accompli. So I think if you have a diversity of ways of structuring the discourse, a diversity of metaphors being used, it can really, allows for different stakeholders to feel their interests are actually being taken seriously. It allows for not one kind of techno-determinist metaphor to drive the entire decision-making process. So again, this is probably a way too easy and Pollyanna-ish proposal, and it's not unique to me at all. But I think a diversity of modes of input and a diversity of languages allows to keep a conversation open. Of course, ultimately, if you want to make something, you have to lock it down on something at the end. But just recognizing the determining power of those metaphors and the way they're actually manifested in different media formats, whether it's a Facebook post, a Twitter feed, or a kit of parts, or a virtual reality type of experience.
That's great. I want to make sure we're running short on time, so I want to make sure if there are any questions from the audience. Can you yell?
These more virtual worlds online and so on. Do you think our appetite for the physical built environment for architecture
Is reduced in the U.S.? Well, there's a whole history going back and forth about how people like Christopher Alexander, an architect, who kind of created systems and philosophies of architecture, influenced software design and back again. And I think that it's long been attractive for people working in screen worlds to reach out to architectural worlds. I'd be curious to know what my co-panelists think about that. Or not.
Other questions?
I have a question for Professor Lowe. You mentioned I guess I see the special toilet in your presentation. Could you say a little bit more about that and if there are digital features on that as well?
I love talking about that toilet. So we have a source separating toilet that separates urine from everything else on North Campus. We were the first such toilet in a university campus. It's different from a composting toilet, so don't get confused. We have a urine processing facility downstairs, and we convert the urine into fertilizer. So that 80% of the nitrogen's in urine, 60% of the phosphorus. The way we treat it in the engineered systems that I teach in my class is absolutely crazy and insane, and we have to change that paradigm. So this toilet, one of the problems with the current source separating toilets is they clog a lot because they're designed where you have a front and a back and there's a hole, and people put toilet paper down and the toilet paper goes right in that hole and it clogs it. So we've had to doctor ours with Gorilla Tape and all kinds of things. This one uses the teacup effect. So if you have a teacup and you pour it slowly, what happens? It dribbles around the edge, right? But if you pour it fast, it pours out. So it's designed so that the liquid dribbles slowly and around the lip. You capture about 80% of the urine underneath the lip and the top. You don't even see it. And then the flush is in the back and never dilutes the water. And you don't have the problems of clogging, and you don't have the problems of dilution. We're trying to keep the water out so that we can concentrate the nutrients. So I can tell you more about it, but I talk about this stuff all the time. I'm sorry if I've insulted anyone, but that's the way it works, and it's really wonderful design. And it is a high-end design. They're designing it it's an expensive toilet, and they're doing it as an art form. Yeah. In fact, they're in New York, a week from this weekend is the U.S. release. They're having an event around it.
Maybe one more? Yeah.
This morning's memory and speculation. Would anybody like to discuss whether a city or an internet is a better memory device or a better speculation device? But too abstract after toilets.
We have to choose? Are we choosing memory or speculation or city or internet?
City or internet, memory or speculation. It's a matrix, man.
I would say that the internet is just one of myriad media forms that is actually embodied in a city. So if you supplement the internet, if you're thinking of that as an inherently digital thing, with all of the other analog, still vibrant, still very relevant forms of media processing and capture and recording that a city embodies, like in everything from its municipal archives to the memories embodied in urban forms to all the type of stuff you talk about in your book, Ambient Commons, the way that the memories of circulation are embedded into the treads that wear into the stairs of a public staircase, for instance. The internet is just one of many ways that a city can serve as a memory device. And in terms of speculation, I have to think about that a bit more. Maybe other folks have thoughts about that.
I say both. I think McLean and I might be saying both and, right?
I was just looking for clarification on the question.
Oh, okay. I think it's both. Yeah.
I don't think either are particularly good for memory. Just thinking about how in both cases, this morning talking about the Wayback Machine and all that, there's some things that you just can't find. And then some things are completely there forever, which is an interesting kind of dichotomy in terms of the internet. Something
like that too.
Well, I don't know. I don't think it is. I mean, if you know, right? If you know that something was there, but that's not actually the city that is the memory. That's us, I would say.
Okay, well with that, I think we'll break for coffee, and then we'll be back in here at 3 o'clock for the final panel. Thank you so much, panelists.